if you're choosing your life and you're choosing it with beginning, middle, and end, there's a basic idea that your life has some purpose, right? It's a well-wrought story.
On the one hand, one has an imminently personal relation to God in being an image of God, but also is radically individual insofar as everyone has a unique likeness to God.
The whole reason for this myth of the tearing apart of Dionysius and the division is to be made whole again, right? And to have the two belong together.
But ultimately, the point is to realize our Titanic potential, which would be true individuality.
Oh, dear Diotima, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh, dear Diotima, tell me why is the good never good enough?
Welcome to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. Today I'm thrilled to have a friend and colleague, Antonio Vargas, here with us. He is a Brazilian Neoplatonist, self-professed. He's the author of Time's Causal Power. And Antonio also has a much-loved and digested YouTube series, channel devoted to Platonic ideas, be it in the Neoplatonist or even astrology. He offers courses both in English and in Portuguese, and yeah, is very much part of the dissemination of the tradition today. And so I'm very proud to have him here to talk about the topic of personal daimons and daimons in general, and the relationship to ourselves and to the gods. I thought we could start with the idea that we see in Diotima's Symposium, which I think is probably the most lucid account of the daimon in Plato's corpus, in which she describes to Socrates that the daimonic is that which is between, knowing and not knowing, between the mortal and the immortal, and that Eros, the god, is actually not a god, but a daimon, something that we're supposed to find as our kind of leader god, that draws us out of ourselves and toward something higher, to kind of riff on the name of the show, The Ladder, that there's something important about seeing this external, not external in the sense of actually external, but something that draws us out of this mortal life and into something higher. And so just thought I'd start there with the symposium.
Thanks, Danny, for that presentation. Yeah, I mean, the symposium is going to be at the center of any conversation that we have about daimonism. And I mean, and we can get this idea of the daimon as what pulls us out of ourselves from the symposium, but also, for instance, in the Timaeus, right, when the celestial daimon is what keeps us rooted in our planet, right, because we're kind of like plants that grow we were sown in the planets and then we grew down here. And I think that's certainly part of the conception, especially also when we look at I'm sorry, I'm just jumping all over the place, but if we look at the right, another central text is the choice of the daimon from Plato's myth of right? And there, of course, we are, as it were, we're choosing our life from with beginning, middle, and end, and not just our general vocation, I don't know, to be a doctor or something, but also very specific abstinence of our life, right? That will be shipwrecked or that will be overthrown and that will lose power and things like that. And then so this indicates kind of like what the diamond is pulling us towards is actually this future that we've already chosen as well. And to circle back to the symposium and just to bring more text into the mix, we can see this also, for instance, in Aristophanes' myth, right? So where the true human beings, the original human beings, they're figured as it were as like two humans back to back, connected. And so we're to them as like a painting of a human being is to us, right? And I like to see that as that image of the two human beings together is like ourselves connected to our diamond, right? Our diamond was there loving us from the beginning, and he is actually the true lover, well, that goes into the Alcibiades. And so I feel that this motif of the daimon as what guides us up morally and in the ladder of virtue is deeply connected with this idea of the daimon as the overseer of the particular life that we're leading.
That for me, all of this is fascinating. I particularly am fascinated by this kind of idea that each one of us has a leading principle, right? A leading God, and that it's something that we chose, that we are connected to. It's our other half. Because I honestly I love that interpretation of Aristophanes, that he's getting at this idea that we're disconnected from the very core that we chose, that we love, and that if only we could be sewn back with our daimonic guide. But at the same time, I think about the Phaedo, right, where people often miss the fact that one of the reasons why Socrates isn't afraid of death is because he knows he's been led by good gods, and that he's going to go on and be such a daimonic principle for the men in the room if they have heard his arguments, if they've caught in wind of the value. And so that here we see, oh no, these daimons used to be human beings, right? They continue, right? That there's this constant cycle of, and that we could like, or for Socrates, that he plans to keep ascending in this kind of rung of, and so could you elaborate on, do you believe that these daimonic principles can ascend themselves into angels and then into gods? And
So when we use the word daimon here, we're using it to name a certain enduring reality and the nature of that reality. And I don't think that it can change its nature. And just to, I mean, maybe this is gone a bit like this is just to backtrack a bit, I thought that maybe like one way for people to get into this idea of the diamond and the one that oversees us is like in and also connected with the question of like that we choose our life. The basic idea, of course, is like if you're choosing your life and you're choosing it with beginning, middle, and end, this basic idea that your life has some purpose, right? It's a well-wrought story, right, which has some teleology to it. And then the idea that there's this personal daimon is then that teleology or that meaning of your life isn't just some inert goal or something, but is active, right? It is the explanation for like why you sometimes turn left instead of turning right, or why you feel, oh, I shouldn't do that, and things like that at significant junctures. So I think it brings out a very odd part of this Platonic worldview, which is that this you this life that you chose, right? I don't know, to be a Brazilian philosopher doing X, Y, and Z, suffering X, Y, and Z in my life. This is actually not me, right? This is the part that I chose, and that my daimon is more immediately connected with that. He's, as it were, the author of this role, and he's going to make sure that the actor plays the part right. But actually, as immortal lives, we are not the parts we play, right? So, and that's one of the reasons why sometimes in Platonists you get this idea that there are two kinds of two each person had two daimons, right? So there would be the daimon of the particular life that I lead, and then and of course that would be a guide to living this part well, right? But then there's also a question of like, but did you choose? But was that a correct choice in the first place for you, right? To choose this life. And so that's why, for instance, Proclean postulates that there are also these celestial daimonists who connect us to our celestial gods, right? Because then they would be the guides or, the separately existing and active norms for our immortal lives, and not just for our mortal life. And now to get to the question of becoming a daimon, becoming a god, Plotinus has this wonderful phrase or a short passage in his treatise on the personal daimon, where he asks, well, after he's explained, like, had this very broad view of transmigration that people can even become plants, and then he asks, well, who will become a daimon? The person who lived like one. Who will become a god? The person who lived like one. And I think that the way I take that isn't that you can actually continually ascend ontological levels, but that you can act in a way like a daimon, in a way that is like a god or like a theos. We'll get to that later. But so I think that we can understand sometimes these suggestions that people can become daimones or theoi as actually indicating that they're capable of higher levels of excellence.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Iamblichus's when somebody was able to see that his leading principle was a god rather than a daimon proper. So, could you tell me what you think? Why is it that the daimon for Socrates is always negative, right? Always saying "don't do this" rather than prescriptive.
Well, I personally don't have a big question about that. The Proclus's explanation is that it was just that the temperament of Socrates was just to be over generous with his time and to want to talk to everyone. And so his diamond didn't need to push him to do anything. He just had to say stop. But so that was, as it were, just a reaction to a modulation of the temperament. I don't see why, if we think of like the personal diamond as this embodied a meaning of our life or something like that, I don't see why it would just be negative.
So you think it's different for each individual?
Yeah, I think it's different for each individual.
You make a taxonomy, which also follows from Proclus, of these angelic daimons. What are they doing?
So we've been talking about the personal daimon, and that's like a very specific kind of daimon. But daimon, as you mentioned, we started with a symposium, is everything that's between mortals and theoi, right? And then Proclus has this taxonomy between angels, messengers, daimones in the strict sense, and heroes, right? And unfortunately, he never like really gets into it and explains it to us. We have to piece it together from many passages. But the but in order, I think the starting point to understand this is just also the more general definition of what a daimon is, right? So, a daimon is a psyche, so you can say a soul or maybe an immortal life, right? And an immortal life, which, however, it is, we are immortal lives too, and we use bodies as instruments. This immortal life itself is an instrument of something else, a nous, right? So a nous is like a self-subsisting, creative, eternal knowledge. So like I like to translate nous in this case as providence, right? So and so the a daimon is in general it's like an immortal agent of providence. And these providences, you can imagine, understand them, for instance, on the model of separately existing sciences, right? So, for instance, you can think of like what keeps horses around. Of course, we have all these practices to make sure that, for breeding horses and so on. But also, there's like the separately existing science of horse biology is making sure that horses continue to exist and reproduce and so on, and that would be the daimon, right? And so I think that's a good starting point for understanding this tripartition into messengers, daimones proper, which are associated with creation, and heroes. So you can think of these as three kinds of sciences, right? So you can associate the messengers with theoretical sciences, right? Things like mathematics and metaphysics and so on. And so they would be daimones that are concerned in they're like embodied forms of these more speculative sciences, and they're concerned with transmitting divine knowledge. The daimones proper, which have to do with creative action and maintaining like different species and also individual, human lives around. They are, as it were, embodied physical sciences, right? So the and or creative sciences, right? Whereas heroes then would be embodied practical sciences. They're embodied ethics, as it were, right? And Proclus says that they are especially concerned with helping people turn towards higher principles, and so that's an initial way that I understand this tripartition.
No, I think it's excellent, right? I mean, this idea because keep in, I mean, I'm convinced that the daimonic, right, as this mediating principle or these mediating principles that they tie us in some such way to the ability to think the absolute, right?
Right.
Things to be intelligible, right? It's that light that goes off that reminds us that we're connected. It's also this beautiful light that can go off when you look at nature or when you're suffering, and so that you know that you're both tied to the natural world, but also tied to this, and so that you realize this kind of weird, beautiful connection that even the demonic that you experience as problematic is really about reminding you of our tie to nature, and that nature too has signatures of the divine in it. And if we don't have that relationship where we see that signature, yeah, the natural world is going to be frustrating rather than part of that, seeing our role as being between two worlds, if you will. And then the heroic is what I would argue shows that, right? That these heroes, right? Like I would argue Socrates belongs in this heroic, daimonic level where you get these people where we see that ethics is not about what is right and wrong, but about giving us a guide again to this unique individual life we can have when we recognize our relationship to entities like the daimonic. And so, oh, and I forgot, I wanted to
Um,
ask you about your connection because you've mentioned twice now the past, present, future, and you just brought up Providence, right? Pronoia. So yeah, could you give me a little bit more insight on your understanding of the daimonic and Providence and time and eternity?
sure. Sure. Well, one thing at a time. So I
Sorry.
mentioned Providence. No, no, it's that things are connected. So I mentioned Providence now as a translation for nous, right? And of course, Providence is, as you just said, typically a translation of pronoia. But pronoia is perversely interpreted by Proclus, right? So Proclus explicitly says, "I don't mean providence in the sense of like a prior plan of how things should happen when I say pronoia," right? He says pronoia means pronoia, an activity that is prior to nous, and nous for Proclus is primary knowledge. So if pronoia is before nous, it's not a cognitive activity, right? It's actually this original activity of bestowing value on things, like before that they have any definite character of their own, right? So, like I translated the Elements of Theology into Portuguese, and it came out a couple of years ago, and then I translated pronoia as charity because it's this idea of this love that is not provoked by recognizing value in the object, but a love that bestows value on the object, right? And that's really um, pronoia for me. So pronoia is this activity of the highest causes of the theoi or the henadic. We can get into them. That establishes, as it were, the primary values of the world, right? Makes them available. And then nous, and then like Proclus follows the Platonic idea that the good or value is prior to nous, prior to the intelligible, because you can't understand what something is if you don't know what the ultimate value it's oriented towards is. And so, as I mentioned, so that means that every providence is going to be, as it were, centered around some value, right, that makes itself known and through charity. And so as it were, the relation between providence and therefore embodied agents of providence, like daimonis and pronoia, is that so the pronoia establishes what the primary values are, and then nous comes and then, as it were, knows all things from the perspective of that value, right? So some things will be more valuable because they're closer to that and further away. But nous doesn't just know everything; it also organizes things according to that, right? And then the agents that organize things according to that are going to be the daimonists, right? So that's how they're going to be doing it. The Now all this we're talking about daimonists, we're talking about things that happen in the world, right? In the world of our experience, and so things that happen in time, right? So and I mentioned already, for instance, past, present, and future in the sense of that we as human beings, as having our life, our life is a certain diachronic whole with beginning, middle, and end, right? And this isn't just true for us, it's true for anything that has structure in this world, right? It's not going to have just spatial structure, it's also going to have some temporal structure from start to finish. And and in the case of things that perish and disappear, then that temporal structure just dies with them and it's just part of them. But in things that keep repeating themselves or that are always part of experience, these temporal structures, they exist on their own as precisely providences, as these daimonists that are responsible for making sure that temporal career takes place, right? And so that and you can say, but wait, we die. Why do we have personal daimonists for our parts? Well, the idea is that there's actually basically, as it were, a finite number of human roles that keep repeating, right? And so although indeed, when we die, the our role ends, but at a later date, someone will pick up that role again, and someone else picked up that role in the past, right? That's the idea.
Yeah, it's interesting here because one of the ways that we've discussed aspects of daimonic in our previous conversations has related to things like Plato's discussion of the poets in the Ion, the question of inspiration, divinely given madness, and so on. And I think this is an interesting conception because there's an interesting relationship here that you're positing between, if you like, the temporal and the eternal, or the eternal recurrence, if you like, of a particular kind of providence, which is something that you could parallel in the nature of creative activity, because on the one hand, original forms of creation, so to speak, are original insofar as, in a way, they're a representation of some archetypal idea. So we recognize perhaps let's say in the broadly Christian Neoplatonic tradition, a sort of recurrent symbolism, a recurrent set of imageries or ideas which present to us a certain consistency of meaning or interpretation, but they come about in new and often novel ways, even though they remain in relationship to something continuous. So yeah, I was quite struck by what you said there about this role of the daimonic as somehow playing this. Well, maybe it goes back to Danny's introductory remark around this intermediary role of where the daimonic sits between the temporal and the eternal in some form in relation to our own provident activities. I don't know if that's something that's you've come across in your work, or if you're interested at all in how that relates to the notion of creativity.
It is certainly something that I'm interested in. I'm even giving a course now on inspired poetry. I'm giving a course on Proust's interpretation of Homer, and certainly insofar as as there is a connection in inspired poetry with the highest principles, the daimonists are there mediating, and it's this connects with something that Danny said about the daimonic in nature, right? So, and about how there are daimonic things that we might not get along with, right? And so it's since these are, as it were, embodiments of particular providences that are trying to, as it were, promote and organize things according to a particular value. And in our level, of course, these values can clash, right, as tragedy shows and so on. And for that reason, there are daimonists that we can call evil. Like they're evil to human beings because they're busy, as it were, like populating the animal world. So they want to convince people to lead bestial lives, right? And that's just not what's best for us, and it's not what we're called for. But that's what they're doing. They're trying to, and this reminds me of like Amerindian uh, myths about how people are literally poached by other animals, right? And so there are these shamanic experiences of when you start to see another animal as a human being, And that's like very dangerous because that means that you're starting to see things from their point of view. So they're going to eat you soon, right? And so and so there are these daimonists that are opposed to us. Now, why is this important for inspiration? Well, because it's a feature of, like epic poetry and inspired poetry that you have, of course, these very what we call anthropomorphized gods, right? That are opposed to each other and that they clash and so on. And we can easily understand this by thinking, well, like, of course, there are many layers to an inspired text, but on the surface level, these clashes happen because on the surface, the references to daimonists, right? And these daimonists can clash, right? And they are also like, as it were, the last stage before inspiration, right? And so they're the immediate contact that mortals have.
No, I mean, for me, it's like I was just lecturing on eudaimonia, right? And, this kind of idea that human flourishing is to be, graced with a good God, so to speak, right? And that, here it goes back to this idea that you were also saying about Aristophanes, right? Like eudaimonia, flourishing of the human being is to be connected to its proper daimon, right? Not necessarily the daimon of the body or the daimon guiding other parts of what it means to be a human being. And so doing that work of discernment, right? Of ordering one's soul, if you will, so that you can see all the different animating features of what it means to be human, and that there's a complexity of these things. And that's part of what, being attached to the theoretical helps us, right? Like, is to go into this realm to where we can think and understand, but then eventually see that there's a providence behind all of these various different animating spirits, if you will, that carry with it something beyond nous, right? Something that is what we call values or feelings, or moments of insight that if we're following our leader gods and what goes beyond that we end up doing, as Gareth would say, creating works of art that inspire, or certain ways of life, as Socrates did, that also inspired, like Ion the Bard, being able to recite Homer without knowing how or why it is the things that they are. And so long and the short of it, that's just one of my weird ways of trying to describe to students that eudaimonia isn't happiness in the sense of a feeling, but it is in some sense a kind of joining or rejoining or marriage with the demonic principles that guide us. And so
You mentioned the Aristophanes myth, and I just like one reason for taking the Aristophanes myth this way, right, is because after we're cut off, after human beings are cut in two, it doesn't seem to play a role in the myth that the people are looking for exactly that other half that they were cut off from, right? So they engage in a number of different amorous entanglements, and of course that's as it were good psychology, good observation. It doesn't seem that a theory of the one really explains human love. But and so that's one reason to think that what were this half that we were cut off from wasn't actually another human soul, right? It was actually something like the daimon, right? That was what that is what connects us to the heavens, right?
in your recent lecture, you want to make a claim or an argument that I find I would love to get some more insight into, because you want to make the claim that theos should be the Titans. Could you explain that roughly, and why that's different than the daimonic, and what role is the identification of the gods with the Titans doing for you, and why?
Right. Okay. So it starts, I mean, the motivation for translating theoi with Titans is first identifying daimonism with gods, right? Or rather translating the word daimon with the word god, right? So because this is an issue. I think that we in ancient philosophy, and I think like not just in ancient philosophy, other people who deal with other periods of the history of philosophy, they get into this, where among scholars we use words in our common languages, and we use them as shorthand for the original language. So, for instance, if I'm talking with you, Danny, and I say intellect, you do not think of the capacity someone has to understand something abstractly, right? You think nous, right? And whatever nous means in this context. And I think that can then lead us to this can lead us astray when we're translating, and then we end up writing sentences that make no sense, like in our modern languages, right? And so, like, well, I could go on this, but let me return. Oh, so for instance, Proclus's claim that pronoia is not a form of knowledge, right? And if you translate pronoia as providence, this just is very, it makes very little sense in English. Now, when I think of the daimonists, as we've been discussing them, right? So they are these embodied agents of providence. They are in time. They can also they respond to human action in time. They are the primary, like they're the most immediate referent for these myths, and they're also like the immediate connection when you're praying. I originally came to this idea that daimon could be translated as God because I was thinking about this personal daimon, right, which is this embodied providence that has accompanied me since my birth, probably since my conception, and is as it were guiding and steering my life. And it's like, how can I express this? And it's like, wait, but this is what I mean when I say, oh my God, right? And something like that. And so it seems like for all these reasons, it really makes sense to translate daimon as God, right? And there are more, like for instance, we can since daimon is our embodied providences, it's unproblematic saying that they know everything that they're all knowing, and also that they are alive and things like that. So I think so there are more reasons, but this is like one huge set of reasons for identifying the two. And then there's a question: wait, if you're translating daimon as God, what are theoi? What are theoi? And then we get into now. I mean, it's a very common thing for philosophers and theologians to hear other people talking about God and say, well, actually, God doesn't mean that, right? Like when people complain about theodicy, or why doesn't God answer my prayers, or what was God doing before he created the world, and things like that. And so it's a very natural, as it were, reaction for us to say, no, the word actually means something else. However, like my suggestion is that if we take God as what most people understand, so like these foundational spirits more powerful than them that are looking out for them are like pursuing some providential plan. It seems like leave people using God to refer to that, and then daimon is closer to what they mean. And then for theoi, we're going to need something else, right? And so what is, and this is especially the case for Proclus, right? Because for Proclus, a theos in the strictest sense, what it is a henad, is a separately existing simple unity or value, right? And he will say things like that it is prior to life and prior to knowledge and prior to essence, right? And this is even more removed from our from how we use the word God than, for instance, Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas' use of the word God, right? Because they all still have, ways of saying, no, God is knowledge, God is love, or something like that, or maybe Aristotle not. But anyway, but this is just, not available if you're going to take Proclus's metaphysics really strictly. And and so I was, trying to find a different word, and I came across Titan. So the first reason, just like a very broad idea, is that Titans are gods before gods. Titans are grand gods, right? And so that already establishes that, yeah, the theoi are causally prior to daimons, right? But then you say, well, but no, like if you read Hesiod, right, or other poets, the Titans are a very specific generation. What are you doing using the word Titan? Well, I think, most people haven't read Hesiod. And we have this, as it were, thanks to Romanticism and pop culture, when you say the Titans, people understand something like, yeah, there were the primordial forces of nature or chaos. And so things like the earth is a Titan, the sky is a Titan, and they're opposed by the gods who are then, forces of civilization and order, Zeus and the Olympians and things like that. And and I think that that's useful because the the gods qua henads, qua absolute values, they are directly responsible for the pre-cosmic chaos for purpose, right? So in Plato's Timaeus, the world is formed starting from these chaotic and disordered changes. And he argues that, well, everything has to depend on the gods. So even these chaotic and changes have to depend on the gods, but they depend on them not as the demiurge, not as the craftsmen of the world, but as these primordially existing values, right? And and so there is something in the Proclean in the Proclean conception of theos that makes it kind of Titanic in this pop culture romantic way, right? Um, and and so and also, of course, there are moments when the Neoplatonists will talk about the Titans and that are there in Tartarus. Now, of course, if we start translating Theos with Titan, then we're going to have to use a paraphrase when we encounter Titanus in the text, right? And so we'll say the gods of Tartarus or Cronus, and we'll have to see the context, right? And we'll find a way to translate that. That's not too difficult. But what does then what's proper to these titans for the Neoplatonists? They were banished to Tartarus. What does that mean? It means they're responsible for Tartarus, right? And so that they are the ultimate grounds for their Tartarus existing. What is Tartarus? Well, it's that one region of the world where where the chaotic pre-cosmic matter still is around, right? And it's a place of punishment for souls because if you send a soul down there that's by nature rational, it suffers a lot being exposed to this chaos, right? And and there's a feature, of course, of Neoplatonic metaphysics, formulated, especially, I mean, after Proclus, but it's already in Iamblichus. So, Elements of Theology 57, right? So that the highest causes have the lowest effects. So there's a mirroring of the highest and the lowest, that was already done. I mean, I already mentioned this principle as it were in the background when I talked about how it's the gods qua henads that produce the pre-cosmic chaos, and so the highest cause the lowest. And I think, of course, this is then one reason to think that, well, maybe highest things and lowest things will have the same names. And we can say, of course, there's Titan in the strict sense, which is the gods responsible for Tartarus. But since all gods, qua gods in the strictest sense, or all theoi, qua theoi in the strictest sense, are responsible for that, we can call them Titans generally, right? And I mean, just to emphasize one point about my proposal, it's not that theos means Titan. My proposal is that theos is translated as Titan in English or Titan in Portuguese, right? It's a question about how we use these words.
Let me see if I can repeat it back just to see if I'm understanding, okay? And so feel free to nitpick because I want to see if I'm understanding this correctly. So it's more along the lines of this idea that what's at the extremes, right, is mirrored at the heights, right? And of course, it's gonna be this kind of doubling, and so it can have this kind of same name, just like we can have, all the ascendants Artemises or Aphrodites, right? And so that, that's part of the work of doing the discernment between, let's say, the representation
Right.
of Aphrodite at the henadic level versus at the embodied physical natural that first stop so to speak in trying to discern.
That's right. So, for instance, we can distinguish between using my proposal, so we can distinguish between the goddess Aphrodite, that would be a daimon, right? And the Titanic Aphrodite, right, which would be ultimately a henad. It's also like if you want other examples of mirroring of highest and lowest, like we say this is one cup, and of course, and we call the gods unities, right? And so that's of course a different example, right? But yeah, so we interrupted your representation.
No. That's basically. That was basically the
Yeah.
thing for me was that.
Yeah, part of this is like is also about like practice and integrating the philosophy into my life, into people's lives.
Mm,
Because I feel that when you use things like daimon or something contrived, like I don't know, numen or spirit, right? Spirit still was what I liked before. We generally, if these words aren't words that like are we use regularly, it ends up not becoming integrated into our life. Like the word Newman will, when you think about the word Newman, you think about like Walter Otto and like other texts. You think about more text, right? Whereas if you use the word God, that has some concrete experience that evokes some concrete connection, and and also like using God for daemonist gives this whole area of the daimonic more substance, right? And you don't think of like it's this if you just of course there is like the symposium saying they are mediators and so on. But if you focus too much on that, you can like as it were, they can become transparent like glass and then you miss them entirely. Right. So part of the idea of using God and gods here is also to give this whole domain some more substance, as it were, and some more concreteness. And then of course you say, but we don't use Titan all the time. No, but then there it's like we use a word that we don't really use because we want to stress also like how weird this concept is, right? And we want to stress how like we want to stress the transcendence. It also has to do with the question of monotheism and polytheism, right? So if we call the theoi gods, then we think that the debate to be had is like, is there one or are there many? Right. Whereas if I call daimonis gods, then there's a sense in which the daimonas they're all organized and all subordinate to nous itself, right? And to providence as such, right? And so there's something about the daimonic that is about the divine then in this translation, which is monocentric, or you might even want to say monotheistic, right? So there is this principle nous as such, which is you could call it divinity as such, even, right? However, the difference now is that look, no, there's something more than pure providence, right? There are these theoi, there are these titans, which are these transcendent values that are beyond providence and grounded and so on. And so that I think moves that debate into like a more interesting area. And it's like clearer that the question is like, what kind of transcendence do the ultimate principles have? Right. And it's not about necessarily is it one or many.
I'm trying to integrate this into my own understanding of Procle's taxonomy of the gods and the divine, and for the same reason, I think that is noble and right and true and just is that you're doing this in order to integrate this into your own practice, your own way of life, right? That this kind of play with the terminology is how you're trying to make it, I guess, fit with your own leader, so that you guys can work together better. But I'm thinking more technically right now, and so please forgive me and I'm thinking about the levels of the intelligible and the intelligent intellective, and the intellective, where at the height of the intellective, we've already got the Titanic gods, and then the intelligible intellective, we have Night and Uranus and the Hundred Handers, and then above that, right, we have more of the Orphic mythology of Thanes, the Orphic tunic. I would argue Metis is the highest height of that. But I won't get into that. I don't want to derail the conversation. But then mythologically beyond, right? So if we can get through the intelligible chamber that we're not supposed to penetrate, unless we're somebody like Orpheus or Hesiod or some great poet. Plato belongs in the sphere too for Proclus, right? And then now we're in the sphere of the one and the dyad, and that's where chaos and aether, and so that what is really beyond providence or pronoia, is, I so I guess I'm looking for the mythological, like, is this aether and chaos just another way of talking about this Titanic for you? Arena, that we're using the myths to get these values before they were even values, and that when Proclus is appealing to the Orphic tradition when talking about it, that's just another way. Because I also think about Olympiodorus and Mascius, where they also use this Orphic understanding of the Titans and the tearing apart of Dionysius, and so your idea sits well with me because it would show that no, the whole reason for this myth of the tearing apart of Dionysus and the division is to be made whole again, right? And to have the two belong together. But I just want to know if I can square it with, the way that Proclus and other Neoplatonists talk about what is prior to intelligibility.
Right. I think it's a question of we're going to have just the word Titan meaning different things, right? And sure, there's going to be a mythological use of Titans where all these theoi that you mentioned are Titanic as, prior to the Olympians in general. But even the Olympians will be Titans on this account, right? So and we'll be talking about like the Titanic Zeus. Sure. We'll be doing that. So and you ask about like ether and chaos. Yeah, I think that's one way of thinking about it, of that they are like a way like that ether and chaos are attributed to unity and multiplicity as such, right? Is I think great for my position because it shows like that there's this connection with chaos for the gods and for the theoi in the strictest sense, right? And also one thing I want to talk about the rending of Dionysus and the commentaries on the Phaedo. So there is a concern, right? So like I follow in this understanding of the Henads as ultimate individuals. I'm really following here um, I'm really following like Butler in many ways, right? But I don't follow him all the way, but in many ways I am. And there's a concern, right? I've found many people to be concerned with this reading of Hannah's because they think, well, that makes these gods these ultimate egos, and we want to, as it were, like these are people who are coming more from like a Buddhist perspective and or broadly Oriental and theosophists and things. And then they say, but that's like just what we want to get away from, right? And there is and so they're saying like another way of saying like you're making the gods into titans in the bad sense, the forces of separation and rending and so on. Damascus makes a point to say that the Titanic life isn't just the irrational life; it's also the rational life when it becomes self-absorbed and separates itself from what's superior. And I think like the answer is yes, but that's like it's the mirroring, right? It's yes, of course. So the worst thing is this rending and this like separation, this individuality in the bad sense. But the point is that the highest things are precisely the positive mirrors of this, right? And so that's a reason to also think that they are to use the same words, because like there is this danger, right? Also in my lecture, I was concerned with this because there's also like the people who really like hear this criticism of you value individuality, so you value like being selfish, and they say yes, good, right? There are people who do this. There are people who are like, and they say, yeah, we should do awful things in order to destroy the cosmos and things like that. And I think, yeah, that's like as from the point when you start doing Neoplatonism and you start saying that to agathon is beyond nous, you've opened that window, for people to start saying, well, if the good is beyond knowledge, then we should wreck everything because that's what true good is, because we want to go beyond nous, right? There are going to be people who, of course, then there are Platonic arguments for saying, no, the way to agathon is through nous, right? But once you've opened the conceptual distinction, that's going to be open. And I think that the again, calling the highest gods Titans captures, as it were, this danger, recognizes it, and lets you say to such people, say, you're not actually acting like proper Titans, like when you're attacking Nous. Nous is, grounded in Titans. So so that's like another, right. So these are like two, as it were, opposing camps that I'm trying to push away here. On the one hand, the anti-individual, Buddhist inspired, and on the other hand, these like left-hand path, anti-cosmic people. And I think that using Titan for Theos manages to steer clear of like both of these.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a Christian conception of the problem as you presented it in terms of this question of relation and the personhood or personal nature of the Titanic beings or something of this kind, and also the concerns you raise around how this relates to certain kinds of Eastern philosophy, in one sense are presented in the problem of on the one hand, radical unknowability of God, if you like, the extremely apophatic sense of beyond all knowing, the unapproachable light and so forth. But on the one hand, one has an imminently personal relation to God in being an image of God, but also is radically individual insofar as everyone has a unique likeness to God. So there's a sort of metaphysical distinction of sorts there between this sense of principle that's both relation and non-relation, to some extent. And I was just thinking there, because I'm more familiar with some of the earlier Christian writings that maybe broach some of these same questions, maybe through questions of angelic hierarchies and so forth. And I was struck by some of the parallels there that one could find in some of the writings of the early church fathers and so forth about trying to come to terms with some of these questions in different ways as well.
Do you have any parallels that you have in mind right now, or I mean, like?
Well, I mean, I was thinking here about how we determine this question of relation, because I was struck by what you were saying earlier around the daimonic and even imagining the nature of these presences or beings as having some active role in determining our providence and so forth. Now, of course, a Christian might seek intercession on the part of the saint or even an angel, a guardian angel, let's say. If we read something like the celestial hierarchy of Dionysius the Areopagite, we find this idea, I suppose, of a kind of hierarchical transmission of a sort of level of development. And this perhaps takes us back to what we were talking about earlier about whether one becomes daimonic or undertakes some kind of theosis to become godlike, as it were. And again, the distinction in the church fathers there, particularly in the Eastern tradition, as it's been continued rather than in the Latin church, is that one is always an image of God, but one can attain to a greater likeness. So in a sense, one can be at the lowest level some resemblance, but can gain a greater likeness to, so undertake a kind of divinization, a kind of perfection. And Dionysius discusses this as part of a kind of transmission, if you like, through stages of angelic hierarchies. So in a sense, these, but similarly, I think what's really interesting thinking here about how we're talking within this very rich imagery. And I was struck in your description, partly perhaps because of the way I think and imagine things, of a very rich kind of cosmic imagery of these connections, not a purely conceptual one, so to speak. But I think this is something you find fascinatingly in a text like the Celestial Hierarchy, that in a sense we approach these questions in what he says as a double way. On the one hand, we undertake it through a kind of reasoning, perhaps through the kind of discursive conversations we're having here. But on the other, we undertake it through a kind of symbolic imagery, through a kind of representative uh, array of pictures, of representations. And I guess he cautions us about being neither reliant on one or the other of those methods, and to somehow find our way between. So perhaps, again, that puts us in some place to consider the role of the daimonic or even the angelic as some kind of phase between. And yeah, I was struck. I mean, this is a slightly off topic in one way, but I'll just mention this because it has a connection to angels. But the writer Valentin Tomberg, who wrote a book called The Meditations on the Tarot, on Christian Mysticism, he has this rather spectacular image of the angel and its wings representing, on the one hand, a kind of effort of imagination and reason, and the other as a kind of form of grace. So the angelic figure and the wings are this sort of picture of mediation between the nature of the angelic intelligence as a disembodied pure intelligence, and then the kind of embodied form of the person, the ensouled body, as undertaking a kind of journey that's both earthbound but heavenly directed in some way.
I mean, there is certainly this concern with individuality and personhood that is shared, and also the question of the image. Exactly what is the image and likeness in human beings, and how does it connect with apophatic theology? So the on the one hand, what the move I'm doing is to recognize, for instance, that human beings as rational agents, their reason makes them like daimonists, right? And so makes them like gods. And so this is really as it were, part of the divine likeness. However, ultimately in Proclus, the signature, the hallmark of the theoi in us is our individuality. The what he even says is responsible for our I. It's the hentes psyches. It's what makes us say I, and I do this and I do that. Organize everything around a single self. And this is something that's beyond our rationality, right? And it's ultimately this basic desire that we have to constitute ourselves as single selves in pursuit of one value, our the Titan we belong to, right? And of course the Titans, since they are beyond nous, they are, properly speaking, they're not intelligible. So they won't. So the apophatic, they will be apophatic in the strict sense. They're not even kind of thing you could know. And if they are known in some way, the this gets into some details of interpretation, but basically how I understand is like the most basic way, the primary way that they are known is through things like fundamental moods in Heidegger's sense, right? So I've talked about them as values that exist prior to knowledge and even prior to the organization of the world. And so if they're going to be present in like a basic presence, it's going to be a mood, something that points to a value, but isn't a mood about this or that, right? And so there would be things like just love or horror or boredom and things like that, or serenity, right? So I recently recorded a video about the intelligible earth, saying that was probably this basic fundamental move of serenity. And so that's so that would be like a distinction about that. Precisely when I say that Daimon is our gods, I'm recognizing that reason in us, like reason and will, these are part of the divine image in us. But ultimately, the point is to realize our Titanic potential, which would be like true individuality beyond rational organization.
Can I ask another question just to test my own understanding of what you're trying to argue, and its connection to some of the things that Gareth was saying about these taxonomies within even Christianity, right? So again, I'm experimenting with seeing if I'm catching what you're saying. That let's take a hero like Socrates or a hero like Achilles, and if we're operating within a Proclean paradigm, this hero has a particular leader god, right? That they have an alignment with, and then that leader god that's leading them is also tied to this Titanic more than Nous, right? And this Titanic is beyond, and it's these fundamental values, right? Before any real articulation of what those things would be, right? So all those moods we have that we can never quite grasp, but every now and again we could say, I'll call it anxiety, or I'll call it excitement, or I'll call it, I just give it a name because, I mean, that's what we're supposed to do as discursive reasoning beings, right? In order to communicate and connect and be able to do the work qua the task that we took on, as you would say in the myth of Ur, right? But what a Socrates and an Achilles do is that kind of generalized idea of excitement, or for Achilles, let's say, vengeance, right? For Socrates, education, right? And the principle of like education, that they embodied it, this kind of what we would think of as a general abstract mood in such a concrete particular way that we can actually see the uniqueness of I don't know, for Socrates, what would you think that general mood would be? Antagonism, I don't know, rebellion, and so with
I
Achilles,
think
yeah.
I don't know. Wouldn't it be like Eros? Wouldn't it
Yeah,
be like
Eros
the Eros?
probably. But what I'm trying to ask is, here, when we say like a generalized mood, it might threaten to make the henadic not individual, but something just general, right? Something, but like I think you're trying to say, and get me wrong, that somebody like the heroes, right? Like our individual lives, we show the concreteness and the uniqueness. There's my moods will never be replicated, but they're still tied to something beyond.
Right. So, I mean, that's kind of like the advantage of using a word like Eros, which is also a proper name. And we can think about this problem about generality um, and individuality also in human relations, right? Because if we think about one person that has a relationship with an enormous amount of people, right? And I mean, like, we don't even need to think about like kings and popes at this level, just the amount of like students that a professor sees, right? They go through, and then we could and and this professor with all the students that they teach nowadays in a modern university, they will have on the one hand there's like this general relationship with them in the sense of the um I don't know what they teach, the content of their teaching. But you can also think of like each individual student having a relationship with our professor. And when I say that it's a fundamental mood, this fundamental mood would be like the presence of that professor. They have a line, let's say. They set the tone for the room. And the thing is, like, our presences, our vibes, this is actually connected with this particular immortal life, embodying this body and so on. But the Titans, they are these simple unities, and they just and uh, their let's say their presence is immediately this mood of their presence, right? So yeah, I don't think because they're present in so many things that we should then think that it's something universal. Also, I should say that the mood itself would not be the henad, it would be the primary, to speak technically, it's the primary being that immediately participates in the henad. It's the noeton that belongs to
Yeah.
each god.
Okay, so we're gonna have to wrap up. But this was a fascinating conversation, and to just tie it back to what Gareth was saying. Just for a moment to get you, like, I think about saints, Gareth, right? Like where each saint, is indicative of a kind of mood, so to speak, that we want to have reverence for, and this idea that for you, Antonio, pronoia is more likely to be understood as charity, right? Like this gift, right? And seeing all of this complexity as this beautiful gift that ultimately comes back down to the beauty, whether or not we think of the individual as a problem or as a pathway towards seeing something beautifully unique at the heart of every little thing. At the end of the day, I find this conversation just thrilling and fascinating. And so thank you both for today's conversation. I hope to have you on again, Antonio, if you're willing. But I'm definitely going to be emailing you some questions because I want to figure this out a little bit more. But in the end, thank you. Gareth, you typically have some closing words as well. I don't know if you do today.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating conversation, and it's given me much food for thought. And I'll certainly be returning to some Proclus after today as well.
Great. Well, thank you both. It was great talking about these ideas with you and talking about Daimonists. And yeah, as I said, like these are just really fresh ideas on my part, and I really look forward to the conversation that develops out of them.
No, I mean, what I love is the willingness to experiment, right? And to find new ways so as to bring more people in to a way of life that can be a little complex and messy and confusing. But what matters is that, we're following our leader gods. All right. Thank you guys.
Yeah, and I think actually one closing remark there maybe is that in a way we were just talking about this sense of, instantiation or exemplification, if you want to call it that, about how do we recognize or see these goods or that thing that Socrates is enacting. And yeah, I'd like to think that these very conversations are some instantiation of that, whether we call it daimonic or angelic or divine, that help us towards that understanding.
That's right. Like this idea of the guardian, right? Because, having these messy conversations where we're trying to figure it out, like that's what we want to model for other people because it is messy, right? Like even for Socrates, like in standing in front of in Athens with Euthyphro, and Euthyphro was like, is this why you're on trial? Is because of your daimon, right? And then all the literature that is, come forth about that. And so I know personally that, that it's a very complex as far as living it thing. And so hopefully, people will see that you can talk about things like guardian angels and have a theoretical and an intelligible aspect to it. And so anyways, thank you guys. Sorry. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, dear God.